Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. I'm Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP, an accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, offering a variety of certificates, master's degrees, and doctorates, both in person and online. You can check out our programs and our courses at our website, iwp.edu. Do any foreign leaders pay attention to President Biden? Sometimes you have to wonder. This week, Israel continued operations in the city of Raffa in the Gaza Strip, pushing further into the former Hamas stronghold and uncovering more tunnels and weapons caches. For weeks, the White House had discouraged Israel from conducting operations in Rafah. The prospect of civilian casualties seemed too great. The White House believed that Israel had no credible plan to move refugees into safer areas. The Biden administration did not want to bear the blame for continued suffering and civilian bloodshed. The president drew a red line around Rafah. For the Israelis, it was supposed to be a no-go zone. There was a flurry of diplomatic activity. The White House placed hopes in a last-ditch series of intense negotiations to bring about a ceasefire to obviate the need for an offensive. But this effort collapsed after Hamas said they would agree to terms that Israel never offered, leaving the impression that the Israelis had spurned a realistic ceasefire deal in favor of renewed military action. Israel moved across the border on May 6th, despite the White House red line, first securing the Rafah crossing into Egypt, then carefully pushing into Hamas-controlled neighborhoods. In response, the White House paused some shipments of munitions that they believed could contribute to civilian deaths. The U.S. also offered, or seemed to offer, that it would trade information on the whereabouts of Hamas terror leader Yahya Sinwar in the warren of tunnels beneath Gaza in exchange for sparing Rafah. This move backfired since if the United States actually knew where a terrorist leader was hiding, it should not be a bargaining chip with an ally, especially not after October 7th. And it turned out the offer was useless because the information the U.S. had was already out of date. It seemed like a sense of panic was setting in over what Israel was going to do. Remember the pre-Rafah hysteria, notably channeled from campus demonstrators to the media, that mass civilian bloodshed was imminent, that the Gazans were penned in Rafah and had nowhere to go. Some alleged that they had been herded there specifically for Israel to be able to finish the poor Gazans off. But these were terrorist talking points. After all, only Hamas benefits from Palestinian suffering. And funny thing, the Rafah operation turned out to be nothing like what many people expected. As in other operations in this conflict, IDF movements were preceded by warnings to the nearly 1 million civilians to move to safe areas. They were directed to an expanded humanitarian zone in al-Mawasi. Israel gave specific instructions where to go and how to get there. Since many people were already living in tents, it was a relatively easy matter to make the move, clearing the way for military operations against the terrorists who remained. U.S. sources had said this movement would take months, if it could even be done at all. In fact, it was accomplished in days and weeks. Once the IDF was on the ground in Rafah, the necessity for the operation became clear. They have eliminated terrorists, found remains of murdered hostages, and uncovered nearly 700 tunnel shafts. 700, think about that. How many subway entrances are there in the Washington, D.C. metro? Which only has 98 stations. Critically, there are around 50 tunnels that led over the border into Egypt, some of which were capable of handling massive vehicles, the smugglers' highway to Hamas. So it has been a very effective operation so far, and the hyperbole of the protesters and fears of the policymakers did not come to pass. And in another twist, it turned out that the last-ditch ceasefire agreement did not, in fact, collapse because of Israeli stubbornness so much as Egyptian sabotage. During negotiations, mediators from Egypt unilaterally changed the generous terms Israel had agreed to when transmitting the proposal to Hamas. This guaranteed that the talks would fail and gave Hamas political cover for appearing to want peace. So now, despite the fact that Israel crossed President Biden's red line, the White House is claiming credit, saying, without evidence, that Israel had listened to American concerns and changed how they had planned to conduct the operation. Because the alternative would be to admit that even after U.S. threats, Israel went ahead and did what it said it would do regardless. Or as one senior Israeli official said, this administration never supports anything we do until we do it. So now the White House says they are satisfied. But not everyone was satisfied. Amidst this measured and careful operation, the International Criminal Court decided to seek arrest warrants for top Israeli and Hamas officials for alleged war crimes. It's as though the ICC had this move ready to go to coincide with the expected mass civilian slaughter in Raffa, except there was none. And you get the idea that Yahya Sinwar and his cronies were only included to forestall the obvious criticism that this was 100% politically motivated and not based on reality. In addition, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the top court of the United Nations, said it would respond to a South African petition for the court to order an immediate halt to the ground assault in Rafah. This order would be purely symbolic, since the court has no means to enforce it, or credible jurisdiction, or military expertise for that matter. Meanwhile, Ireland, Spain, and Norway are showing their displeasure by announcing they will recognize Palestine as a state. This is not exactly groundbreaking, since a majority of the countries in the United Nations already recognize some form of Palestinian statehood. This started in 1988 when terrorist leader Yasser Arafat unilaterally proclaimed PLO sovereignty over all the supposed Palestinian territories. 78 countries quickly affirmed this move, led by communist governments, third world countries, and the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Such recognition signals virtue, but has little practical impact. But given the timing, what symbolism does Ireland, Spain, and Norway intend? With Israel at war, it seems to be a reward for terrorism. Stepping back a minute, the fact of Israel going into Rafah despite White House warnings fits a pattern of foreign leaders not listening to President Biden. For example, in 2021, the White House warned Ethiopia to ramp back its counterinsurgency against Tigrayan rebels or face consequences. Ethiopia went ahead anyway, mostly pacifying the region with assistance from the United Arab Emirates. The U.S. imposed some mild sanctions and began lifting them 2 years later. In February 2022, President Biden had an hour-long, serious conversation with Vladimir Putin, threatening a decisive response that would impose swift and severe costs on Russia should they invade Ukraine. Putin did it anyway. Then the White House urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to flee his capital in face of the Russian advance. "The fight is here," Zelensky memorably responded. "I need ammunition, not a ride." Ignoring American advice gave Zelensky a Churchillian moment of defiance that rallied his people to push back the invader. Since then, U.S. sanctions against Russia have been ineffective, and U.S. aid to Ukraine inadequate. In January, the White House threatened military action against Houthi rebels in Yemen who were attacking international shipping in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea. The Houthis ignored the warning. Then the United States and coalition forces began limited strikes against the Houthis. But the terror attacks continued and even intensified, despite the coalition military response. The White House even promised immediately to reconsider the Houthis' status as a specially designated global terrorist group if they would please just stop. But the Houthis have ignored the carrots as well as the sticks. Last April, when Iran threatened to retaliate directly against Israel for an attack in Syria that killed Iranian generals, President Biden said his message to Iran was, "Don't." Iran went ahead anyway, and the attack was blunted by an impressive, coordinated international defensive effort. When Israel then planned to make a counterstrike against Iran, the White House counseled to take the win instead and do nothing. Israel went ahead anyway. Afterwards, the White House had no comment except to deny involvement. So Israel's move into Rafah fits this pattern. A country signals its intentions, the White House issues a warning. The country acts, the White House may or may not respond, rarely decisively and with limited impact. There must be some example of where the president said don't and the other side blinked. But I'm not sure what it is. This gets back to the basic impulse of the Biden administration to attempt to manage conflict. Not to win, not to seek a permanent solution, but just to keep things settled, to degrade capabilities, to prevent escalation, to convince adversaries that their actions are futile, even if they aren't. But you can't have deterrence without creating fear of serious and lasting consequences. You can't end conflict by telegraphing your fervent desire that warfare stays in a box. You can't tell an adversary they face strictly limited military responses without handing them the initiative to decide how intense that conflict will be. And you can't back an ally by demanding they not pursue victory, even if you find the concept distasteful. The conflict management approach simply produces more conflict to manage. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next week for another edition of the IWP Podcast.